Okay, welcome to the deep dive. Let's be honest, you are just surrounded by information, aren't you? I mean, articles, research papers, notes, opinions coming at you from everywhere.
It's overwhelming sometimes. It feels less like accessing knowledge and more like, I don't know, trying to drink from a fire hose.
Exactly. How do you even begin to make sense of it all? How do you filter it, evaluate it, and, actually use what you're seeing?
Well, that constant flow is just the reality now. And simply absorbing it or even just trying to remember everything, it just isn't enough anymore. You really need active strategies, ways to process it all.
To figure out what's reliable, what matters.
I mean, what it truly means, yeah.
Absolutely. And that's precisely our mission for this deep dive. We've gathered a whole stack of sources. You shared articles, some academic reviews, practical handbooks, even some hands-on exercises.
Yeah, real mix.
All focused on two absolutely essential skills for dealing with that information deluge: analytical thinking and critical thinking.
Our goal today is to take these sources and really unpack them. We want to get a clear handle on what these skills actually are, how they relate to each other, and why they're just so incredibly important.
Not just in school or at work.
No, definitely not. In everyday life, too. And we'll dig into the common pitfalls, the sort of mental habits and biases that, well, trip us all up sometimes.
And crucially, pull out the practical stuff.
Exactly. We're going to extract the specific practical methods and activities described right there in the sources that you can actually use, like starting tomorrow, to enhance these abilities.
Think of this as your shortcut, maybe. A way to understand not just what analytical and critical thinking are, but how to genuinely get better at them.
We'll pull out the key insights, maybe some surprising facts along the way.
And give you some actionable takeaways. Hopefully you'll leave feeling a bit more clued in and maybe more confident in your own judgment when you face that next wave of information.
Right, let's jump in. Let's start this deep dive.
All right, let's get started. First things first, let's lay some groundwork. We need to define these two terms clearly: analytical thinking and critical thinking, based on what these sources are saying. So starting with analytical thinking, what's the core idea there?
Okay, so based on these materials, analytical thinking is fundamentally about taking something complex, could be a problem, a bunch of data, situation, and breaking it down.
Deconstructing it.
Exactly. Breaking it into its smaller, more manageable components. It's described as a really methodical process. You're examining the data, the details, in a systematic, objective way.
So it's structured.
Very much so. And the goal isn't just to take it apart, but to understand how all those pieces fit together. Identifying relationships, drawing logical connections.
And using that understanding to work towards a solution.
Precisely. Ultimately, you're developing solutions or a deeper understanding based on that breakdown.
Okay, so if I'm faced with, say, a complicated piece of machinery, analytical thinking is like taking it apart, carefully labeling each bit, figuring out how they connect.
That's a great analogy. You're dissecting it to really grasp its structure and function. One source, Primist, I think it was, points out that analytical skills are specifically about using data and facts, tangible evidence, to actually support the solutions or conclusions you come up with.
So it's not just guesswork.
Not at all.
Wow.
It's grounded in evidence.
And a really key part of that, according to one of the other sources, Aluba, is data evaluation. Can you elaborate on that?
Oh, absolutely critical. Before you can even start breaking things down or using the data effectively, you have to be able to gather that information. And this is crucial. It says its quality. Is it reliable? Is it credible?
Okay, garbage in, garbage out, right?
Exactly. If your foundational data is weak or flawed, then your analysis, no matter how systematic you try to be, is probably going to lead you down the wrong path. So evaluating the source, the validity of your information, is really an embedded part of good analytical thinking.
Got it. So analytical thinking is the breakdown, the systematic look at the parts, backed by solid data evaluation. Now, how does critical thinking fit in? Is it basically the same thing, just a different name?
No, they're definitely distinct, though they are deeply related. Critical thinking is often described as a metacognitive process.
So thinking about thinking.
Pretty much, yeah. Thinking about your own thinking. One source, that evaluative review, gives a really useful definition. It says critical thinking consists of both cognitive skills, things like analysis, evaluation, inference, and these things called critical thinking dispositions.
Skills and dispositions. Okay, that adds another layer. So it's not just about having the ability to think critically.
Right. It's also about having the inclination, the willingness, the sort of tendency to actually apply those skills.
Interesting. So you need both the tool and the will to use it.
Precisely. The review says it's driven by purposeful, self-regulatory, reflective judgment. You're intentionally stepping back, looking at your own mental processes, how you're reaching conclusions. And the outcome of doing this well, as that source puts it, is increasing the chances of producing a logical solution or a valid conclusion. It's really about improving the quality of your thinking itself.
Okay, so if analytical thinking is taking the machine apart, critical thinking is more like stepping back and asking, wait, why did I take it apart this way? Did I miss anything? Are my assumptions about how this machine works actually correct? Am I being objective here?
That's a really good way to put it, yes. It's evaluating the whole process, questioning those underlying assumptions, and ensuring the final judgment is as sound and unbiased as possible.
And other sources back this up.
Yeah, the Knowledge Academy and Primus materials reinforce this idea. They explain that critical thinking combines open-mindedness, being genuinely willing to consider different ideas, different perspectives, with those strong evaluation skills you mentioned.
So you're not just accepting things.
Definitely not. You're carefully reviewing the evidence, you're asking probing questions, you're actively considering various viewpoints, and only then, after all that work, do you make a judgment. And that judgment isn't just pulled out of thin air, it's informed by a blend of, yes, your opinion, but also your knowledge, your past experience, and any relevant expertise you have.
So how do these two really powerful ways of thinking work together in practice? Is it like first you analyze, then you critique, or do they overlap?
Well, the sources make it pretty clear they're complementary. They work best together. While you can use them individually, like you might analyze a huge data set without doing a deep dive into your own potential biases, or you could critically evaluate someone's argument without crunching any numbers yourself.
Right.
But really effective critical thinkers often use their analytical skills as the first step.
Ah, okay. So analysis kind of provides the raw material, the detailed picture.
Yeah, exactly. Analytical breakdown gives you that clear understanding of the components, the data, the relationships. Critical thinking then takes that understanding and puts it under the microscope. It evaluates it, it questions the assumptions made during the analysis, it considers alternative interpretations or different ways of looking at it, and then it uses that reflective judgment to arrive at a more comprehensive, more robust, and better supported conclusion or solution.
So combining them leads to deeper insight.
Definitely. As sources like Bazalazzi and Primus suggest, integrating both leads to much deeper understanding and ultimately more informed and effective outcomes.
Okay, so why do these skills matter so much? We hear about them all the time in education, job ads, even just talking about navigating the news. What's the actual real-world value here?
Oh, the sources are completely unanimous on this. They are absolutely essential skills for modern life. That evaluative review highlights them as a key desired outcome of education, precisely because they move students beyond just, memorizing facts.
Towards actually understanding complex stuff.
Exactly. A more complex understanding of information. They directly improve judgment and decision-making abilities. And this is really important. It makes you less susceptible to cognitive biases and that heuristic thinking.
Those mental shortcuts.
Yeah, those quick shortcuts our brains love. They're efficient, sure, but they can lead to some pretty significant errors in judgment if we rely on them too much. Critical thinking helps us catch ourselves.
So essentially, these skills help you think more clearly, more independently, and maybe avoid being easily misled or fooled.
Precisely. And it's not just for academics or students. The evaluative review points out that critical thinking is necessary for everyday decision-making and problem-solving in all sorts of contexts. Social situations, interpersonal disagreements.
Like deciding what to believe online.
Absolutely. Or figuring out how to approach a difficult conversation with family, or tackling a complex personal problem like a career change. You're using these skills constantly, maybe without labeling them.
And in the business world, they seem almost mandatory now.
Oh, completely. Primus, Aluba, Visology, they all hammer home how crucial these are in the workplace. Essential for strategic planning, for accurately assessing risks, for driving innovation by spotting new opportunities or different ways of doing things.
And improving efficiency, too.
Yeah, by analyzing current processes to find weaknesses. Primus specifically calls them vital for high performance and for leadership development. You can't really lead effectively without them.
Okay, and this feels like a really important clarification point, especially from that open university source. For anyone who hears critical thinking and thinks it just means being negative or, constantly telling experts they're wrong.
Yes, that source makes a great distinction. It clarifies beautifully that critical thinking isn't about just dismissing expert knowledge out of hand or being contrarian just for the sake of it.
It's not about tearing things down.
No. It's about fostering a deeper understanding of the expert's viewpoint, sure, but also considering alternative perspectives, looking at other data, and engaging in your own thought process, your own research, your own evaluation that informs your independent judgment.
So you own your conclusion.
Exactly. At, say, a postgraduate level, you're expected to read widely, engage with different scholarly arguments, question them, and then form your own well-supported analysis. Not just pick one authority and parrot them. It's really about empowered understanding, not arrogant dismissal.
That reframes it nicely. It's about building your own informed perspective based on a thorough process.
Precisely. Take an intellectual ownership, really.
Okay, before we jump into the really complex strategies and techniques, the sources remind us that building these skills starts with some pretty fundamental abilities. You can't analyze complex arguments if you can't follow a basic one, right?
Absolutely. You need the building blocks. One source, VEE, which is packed with practical exercises, really highlights this. Before anyone can truly master those higher-level skills, classifying, inferring, detailed analysis, they first need to learn to simply recognize and recall key information accurately.
Recognize and recall. That sounds almost basic, like just memory work.
It might sound simple, but think about it. It's the essential foundation. You can't analyze information if you don't actually have it accessible in your mind, or if you can't retrieve it accurately. The VEE source uses lots of activities designed to build just this capacity. They have things like trivia tracked down.
Oh, trivia. Okay, that sounds less intimidating. What kind of questions are we talking about?
Pretty straightforward recall stuff like how many squares are on a checkerboard, or what is the name of Mickey Mouse's dog? What kind of animal is Babar? What was the name of the Wright brothers' airplane?
Okay, testing the memory banks.
64
squares, Pluto. Babar's an elephant. The flyer.
Right. And others like, what is the capital of New York? What do frogs have in their mouths that toads don't? Who was the first woman on the Supreme Court? What nations border the continental U.S.?
Albany. Frogs have teeth, toads don't. Sandra Day O'Connor. And Canada and Mexico.
There you go. The source confirms all those and adds a couple more, like Dr. Seuss creating the Cat in the Hat and one queen bee per hive. See, these aren't complex analytical puzzles, they're direct tests of recall and recognition. Can you pull that specific piece of information out when needed?
So step one is simply having the raw data, the facts, available to work with. What other foundational skills do these activities focus on?
Well, many of them focus on recognizing patterns, sorting information, classifying things. Activities like listing items based on categories, name foods that begin with B, or list some fast food restaurants. What foods are white? Name things that grow below ground, things that grow on trees.
Right, applying a simple rule or filter.
Exactly. It requires you to search your knowledge base, apply that specific rule, and then organize the information based on that shared characteristic. Word games are also used quite a bit.
Like compound words?
Yeah, adding a word to make new ones. Eye plus lash, brow, sight. And then they often challenge you to use those new words in sentences, which pushes you to understand their meaning and context, not just recognize the word itself. Defining words is another basic but crucial exercise. Can you actually articulate what a concept means?
And they also mentioned extracting details from text, like reading comprehension.
Yes, a classic skill, but totally foundational for any kind of analysis later on. The source gives an example about reading a passage on the Arctic region. Then, the task is to systematically pull out specific facts mentioned within that text.
Like who lives there?
Right. The people, Eskimos, Lapps, Yakuts, Chukchi mentioned. The locations included Arctic Ocean, Greenland, Iceland, northern parts of North America, Europe, Asia. The animals found there, the climate characteristics. You're basically identifying and isolating key pieces of information embedded within a larger block of text.
Okay. And what about things like hidden word activities or those magic words and anagrams? How do they fit in?
Those engage slightly different cognitive muscles, but still foundational. Hidden word puzzles like decoding simple phrases, go fish, be artistic, calm iced, etc., involve pattern recognition and decoding seeing structure within apparent randomness.
Like cracking a simple code.
Kind of. And magic words or anagram adventure where you have to visualize letters, mentally rearrange them, see how different combinations create new meanings. That's about recognizing that the same components can form different structures.
Which is fundamentally analytical, right? Looking at the pieces and seeing their potential arrangements and relationships. That makes sense. So the foundation is really about being able to find information, remember it, sort it, spot basic patterns, pull out key details. Okay, once you've got those building blocks more or less in place, one of the sources introduces a really powerful framework for taking the next step analyzing thinking itself, the elements of thought.
Yes, this framework comes from the analytic thinking and applied critical thinking sources, and it's incredibly useful. It proposes that basically any instance of thinking, any piece of reasoning, whether it's yours or an article you read or conversation you're having, has 8 fundamental structures or elements embedded within it.
8 core components of any thought process.
Exactly. And learning to consciously identify these elements in any thinking process is the key to being able to analyze that thinking explicitly and rigorously.
Okay, what are these 8 elements? Can you list them?
Sure, they are purpose, question, information, interpretation, inference, assumptions, concepts, point of view, and implications, consequences.
All right, let's quickly unpack those. Purpose, that's pretty straightforward, the goal, right?
Yeah.
What are you trying to achieve with this thinking?
Exactly. And the question is the specific problem or issue being addressed. Information is the data, the facts, experiences, evidence being used. Those first 3 are fairly intuitive, I think.
Okay. What about interpretation or inference? That sounds a bit more complex.
That's about figuring out what the information means. It's the conclusions or inferences being drawn from that data, what patterns are being spotted, what logical connections are being made between the pieces of information.
And assumptions. We hear a lot about those.
Crucial element. These are the beliefs being taken for granted as true, often without proof. They're critical because so often they're hidden, they're unstated, they're just assumed.
The things we don't even realize we're taking as fact.
Precisely. Then there are concepts. These are the key ideas, the theories, the definitions, the principles that are central to the thinking. Like if you're thinking about justice, justice itself is a key concept.
Got it. Point of view.
This is the perspective, the frame of reference, the particular angle or orientation from which the thinking is happening. Where are you metaphorically standing when you look at this problem or issue?
And finally, implications and consequences.
These are basically the so what? What follows logically from the thinking? What are the potential outcomes, positive or negative, if this line of reasoning is accepted or acted upon?
Wow. Okay, so by consciously identifying these 8 elements, you can essentially, reverse engineer or dissect any argument, any decision, any thought process.
That's the idea, precisely. The sources argue that understanding these structures gives you a powerful toolkit for asking crucial questions, not just about others' thinking, but about your own, too.
Like what kind of questions?
About your own thinking. What's my real purpose here? What question am I actually trying to answer? What information am I relying on, and is it solid? What assumptions am I making, maybe without realizing it? What's my point of view, and how might it be limiting me?
And applying it to information you encounter.
Same process. What's the author's purpose in writing this? What question are they trying to address? What specific information are they using? What assumptions are they making that maybe aren't stated? What's their point of view influencing this? What are the implications if I accept their conclusion?
That really shifts you from just passively receiving information to actively analyzing how it was constructed. It's much more engaged.
Absolutely. The analytic thinking source gives a nice practical example using the idea of contributing to a healthy biosphere.
Okay, how does that work?
Well, if your purpose is to increase your personal contribution to a healthy biosphere, then your information might include details about what you currently do that contributes to pollution, alongside a list of potential actions you could take to reduce your impact.
Right, the data.
The core concepts you're dealing with are things like pollution and healthy biosphere. Your point of view might be seeing pollution as a problem that you personally have some power to help solve, rather than something totally outside your control.
And the conclusion.
And your solution or conclusion might be deciding to research those potential actions further and then commit to putting the most feasible ones into practice. See how you can map the whole thinking process onto that framework.
Yeah, that makes it very clear. And they mentioned this framework can even be used to analyze entire academic disciplines.
Yes, the sources suggest you can get to the core of different fields of study by identifying their inherent elements of thought. For science, for example, the purpose is often figuring out how the physical world operates. Key questions might revolve around cause and effect or predicting natural phenomena. The information is typically empirical data from observation and experiments.
And history.
For history, the purpose is often understanding the past, perhaps to inform our understanding of the present and future. The information comes from primary and secondary sources, artifacts, testimonies, and so on. Their interpretations involve constructing narratives and arguments about past events. Applying the framework helps clarify the distinct nature and goals of different kinds of inquiry.
Okay, and tying this back to the foundation, all this analysis, all this critical evaluation, it absolutely requires solid information to stand on, doesn't it?
Fundamentally, you can't analyze thin air. The Lumen Learning Source really stresses that analysis needs to be thoughtful and credible. It can't just be based on opinion floating free from facts. You must back up your claims with solid evidence, specific examples, relevant quotes, data, verified facts.
Which brings us back to that data evaluation piece we talked about earlier.
Exactly. Assessing the quality, the reliability, the credibility of your sources is non-negotiable. That evaluative review had that interesting little anecdote about learning referencing in school.
Right, at age 12.
Yeah. The author reflects on how learning about citing sources connected directly to the idea that claims need support. If a reference isn't available, or if the source isn't credible, you absolutely have to question the basis of the belief or the statement being made. Is it grounded in logic and verifiable evidence, or is it perhaps just based on emotion, ingrained bias, or some unexamined intuitive judgment?
It really drives home that rigorous thinking isn't just about clever arguments. It's always anchored in evidence.
Absolutely. So the foundation is about recognizing and recalling information, then applying frameworks like the elements of thought to structure your analysis, and always grounding everything in credible, evaluated evidence.
Build from the ground up. Makes sense.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got the definitions, we understand why these skills are so important, and we've looked at the foundational steps. But let's be real, thinking clearly isn't always easy, is it? The sources definitely highlight several obstacles, common pitfalls that can really get in the way, even if you technically have the basic skills.
You're absolutely right. And being aware of these potential barriers is, well, it's paramount if you want to overcome them. Both the Open University and the Applied Critical Thinking sources stress that effective critical thinkers have this kind of meta-awareness. They're aware of the limits of their own knowledge, and crucially, they understand how their own thinking processes can sometimes mislead them.
That self-awareness seems key, knowing your blind spots. So what's the first major barrier the sources identify?
One really significant barrier discussed, especially in the evaluative review, is having inadequacies in either the cognitive skills or those critical thinking dispositions we mentioned earlier.
Right, the skills and the willingness or inclination.
Exactly. It's not enough to know how to analyze an argument or evaluate evidence if you're not actually motivated or inclined to do it, especially when it challenges your own beliefs.
So you could have, like, the sharpest analytical mind around, but if you're fundamentally closed-minded or just unwilling to question your own deeply held views, you're still not really thinking critically in practice.
Precisely. And the flip side is also true. You might be incredibly open-minded, genuinely curious, really wanting to think critically, but maybe you lack the specific skills, the techniques for rigorous analysis or effective evaluation strategies.
You need both parts of the equation.
You really do. The evaluative review notes that often, educational instruction focuses more heavily on the skills because, well, they seem more concrete, maybe trickier to teach, and definitely easier to measure on tests. But just having the skill doesn't guarantee you'll use it when it counts, and just being inclined doesn't mean you have the actual capability. The sources emphasize they're mutually dependent. Weaknesses in either area will significantly hinder effective critical thinking.
That makes a lot of sense. It really is a package deal. Okay, what about intuitive judgment? That sounds like relying on your gut.
Yes. This is a big one discussed in the evaluative review. It's about our natural tendency to rely too much on what psychologists call fast thinking, those quick automatic judgments based on heuristics, those mental shortcuts.
Our brain try to be efficient.
Exactly.
Right.
And often it works fine. But for complex issues, relying too heavily on intuition can lead to being, as the source puts it, cognitively lazy. It essentially bypasses the slower, more effortful, reflective judgment that genuine critical thinking demands.
Like going with the first thing that pops into your head without really checking it.
Pretty much. The source gives some good examples, like instantly accepting numerical data just because it looks official, without stopping to ask about the source, the methodology behind it, or whether it tells the whole story. Or, maybe more commonly, making statements based on stereotypes or preconceived notions, what they call schema-based intuitive judgment.
Schema-based.
Yeah. Your brain quickly matches a new person or situation to an existing mental pattern or schema you hold, and then applies a pre-packaged judgment or expectation without taking the time to reflect on the unique specifics of this particular instance. You jump to a conclusion based on a category rather than the individual details.
So our brain's efficiency, its pattern matching ability, can actually work against our accuracy in complex situations.
Often, yes. It requires conscious effort to override it.
Mm.
Another huge barrier, probably one of the most talked about, is bias and assumptions.
Our built-in filters.
Exactly. Our personal values, our beliefs, our cultural background, our past experiences, they don't just sit in the background. They actively filter how we perceive information and how we interpret it. And many of the assumptions we operate under are hidden or implicit.
We don't even know we're making them.
Right. They're buried deep, maybe held unconsciously, and they're very seldom brought out into the light to be examined or challenged. We just treat them as reality.
And the sources say that's dangerous.
Extremely. The Applied Critical Thinking Handbook emphasizes this strongly. Assumptions must be challenged, because if your foundational assumptions are faulty, then any conclusions or decisions you build on top of them are likely to be faulty too. Unchallenged assumptions essentially prevent true insight. They lock you into a certain way of seeing things.
And confirmation bias is a classic example of this kind of thinking error, isn't it?
It's a prime example, yes. Confirmation bias is that pervasive tendency we all have to seek out, interpret, and remember information in a way that confirms what we already believe. We actively look for evidence that supports our view and tend to ignore, downplay, or find flaws in evidence that contradicts it.
We like being right.
We do. Critical thinking, though, runs in direct opposition to this. It involves actively seeking disconfirming evidence, looking for reasons why your initial idea might be wrong. The Applied Critical Thinking Handbook even mentions specific tools, like the analysis of competing hypotheses, which systematically forces you to try and disprove various potential explanations for something, including challenging the assumptions underpinning each one.
Wow. Actively trying to prove yourself wrong sounds difficult, very counterintuitive to how we usually operate.
It is, and that's exactly why it requires conscious effort and the right disposition. It doesn't come naturally for most of us. Another related barrier discussed in that handbook is the concept of frames.
Frames, like mental frameworks or perspectives again.
Yes, similar, but specifically mental structures. The source describes them as these simplified mental models that help us organize and make sense of complex reality. They guide our understanding. But the danger is that they can also distort or selectively filter what we perceive. We often adopt and operate within just one frame without even realizing it.
We just see the world through that one lens.
Exactly. And challenging our shifting frames is incredibly difficult if you're not even aware that you're using one. Often, the first frame that comes to mind for a problem is the one we stick with, rather than consciously trying on other possible frames to see if they offer different insights.
So our helpful mental models can actually blind us to other possibilities or interpretations.
Precisely. Then there's hubris and overconfidence. This is about being overly confident in our own ability to predict future outcomes or to understand highly complex situations or even just accurately assess the extent of our own knowledge.
Thinking we know more than we do.
Yeah, and this overconfidence can lead to some seriously flawed planning and poor decisions. The Applied Critical Thinking Handbook notes that some experts even argue that trying to make precise predictions in highly complex, dynamic environments is inherently impractical. Instead, they suggest focusing on building systems that are adaptable and can react quickly to unforeseen events rather than relying on predictions that might be based on overconfidence.
That's a different way to think about planning. Less predicting, more adapting.
A very critical thinking approach to complexity. And finally, another major barrier, especially in organizational settings, is groupthink.
Ah, the pressure to conform.
Exactly. This is a powerful social dynamic where the pressure for harmony or conformity within a group overrides a realistic and rigorous appraisal of alternatives or potential problems. Even in groups that have, structured decision-making processes on paper, the symptoms of groupthink can creep in.
Like what kind of symptoms?
Things like limiting the discussion to only a few options, ignoring warnings or negative feedback from outside the group, individuals censoring their own doubts to avoid conflict, or developing an illusion of invulnerability. It can lead to really poor, sometimes disastrous decisions because the critical evaluation gets shut down by social pressure.
That's fascinating and a bit scary, how social dynamics can undermine both individual critical thinking within the group and the collective critical thinking of the group itself.
It really highlights the interplay between cognitive and social factors. So yeah, just recognizing these potential potential barriers, the lack of skills or disposition, the trap of quick intuitive judgments, our inherent biases and hidden assumptions, getting stuck in mental frames, overconfidence, and the pressures of groupthink. Simply being aware of them is the absolutely essential first hurdle to overcome.
Awareness is definitely the starting point for making any change.
Couldn't agree more.
Okay, so we've identified what these skills are, why they're so vital, and importantly, what kinds of things get in our way. But the good news, right, is that the sources are pretty clear that these aren't fixed traits. You're not just stuck being an analytical or unanalytical person.
Absolutely not. That's a key takeaway.
Yeah.
These are skills and dispositions that can be consciously developed, practiced, and significantly enhanced through targeted instruction and deliberate effort. You absolutely can become a better analytical and critical thinker.
That's encouraging. So where do we start putting this into practice? What are some of the concrete methods and activities the sources suggest we can use?
Well, one suggestion, which is particularly relevant if you happen to be in a position where you teach, mentor, or lead others, is to actively model thinking.
Show, don't just tell.
Exactly. The Vidia source suggests explicitly sharing your own problem-solving strategies out loud. Articulate how you're arriving at conclusions, what steps you're taking. Be open to unusual or unexpected solutions that others might propose, showing that you value different approaches. And actively encourage the people around you to see themselves as capable thinkers. You essentially make the invisible process of thinking visible for others.
Leading by example, showing the mental work.
Yes. Another powerful technique, which is described in slightly different ways in both the Evaluative Review and the Applied Critical Thinking Handbook, is embracing the idea of playing devil's advocate.
Okay, this is where you deliberately take the opposing side of an argument, right?
It's a bit more strategic than just disagreeing for the sake of it. It means consciously and systematically second-guessing claims, assumptions, and conclusions, whether they're your own or someone else's. It involves asking why repeatedly, kind of like the Socratic method, and actively conjecturing plausible alternative explanations or scenarios.
The goal is to really pressure test the idea.
Exactly. To rigorously test it from an opposing viewpoint. It forces you to look for weaknesses, inconsistencies, or gaps in logic in your own arguments or in others. It's fantastic for revealing potential biases or blind spots you might have missed. The Applied Critical Thinking Handbook even describes a specific structured technique called the Devil's Advocacy Tool, where a person or a dedicated team is formally assigned the role of trying to find disconfirming evidence for a favored hypothesis or proposed plan.
Wow, formalizing the opposition. That sounds like a really potent tool for combating confirmation bias head-on.
It really is. It forces you out of your comfortable narrative. Closely related to this is developing the art of strategic questioning.
Asking better questions.
Fundamentally, developing the ability to ask the right questions, the essential questions, is absolutely fundamental to both analytical and critical thinking. And understanding those elements of thought we discussed earlier, purpose, question, information, assumptions, concepts, point of view, implications, is invaluable here. That framework helps you structure your questions so they effectively probe the core components of any thinking process you're examining.
So the framework guides your questions.
Yes, and the handbook also notes that using structured analytical frameworks in general can help generate relevant and insightful research questions when you're faced with a really complex problem or unfamiliar situation.
Okay, what about self-awareness? We talked about lack of it being a barrier. How do you actively enhance it?
Boosting self-awareness is highlighted as a crucial practice. The Applied Critical Thinking Handbook actually dedicates a fair bit of space to this. It talks about the importance of introspection, consciously looking inward to understand your own personality traits, your core values, your typical habits, your emotional patterns, your needs. This is often called emotional self-awareness.
Knowing yourself better.
Exactly. Understanding these things helps you identify your own cognitive strengths and weaknesses, your underlying motivations, the things that trigger emotional responses in you, all of which directly impacts how you process information and make decisions. Knowing your personal values, in particular, is seen as really important because they shape your perspective and determine what you prioritize, often unconsciously.
And the handbook suggested a specific exercise for this.
Yes, it mentions the Who Am I exercise as a structured way to practice this kind of introspection. It involves deliberately reflecting on significant personal experiences that have shaped you.
Like what kind of experiences?
Things like your family narratives, the stories you grew up with, the culture of your region or country, your religious or spiritual background, if any. key educational experiences that made an impact, and particularly what they call critical watershed moments, those specific life events that significantly shifted your worldview, your values, or how you see yourself in the world around you.
So digging into your own history.
Yes. And the idea is that this reflection, which can sometimes be followed by sharing these insights within a trusted group, helps you uncover the roots of your own mental frames, your biases, your hidden assumptions. The sources suggest that self-reflective thinkers make a conscious effort to defer their initial gut judgment and actively consider how their deep-seated values and beliefs might be influencing their thinking in the current moment.
That sounds like pretty deep work, but probably essential for really understanding your own filters before you try to analyze anything else objectively.
It absolutely is. And building directly on that self-awareness, another critical practice is to actively seek out and genuinely consider multiple perspectives.
Getting outside your own head, essentially.
Literally and figuratively, yes. The HBS online source and the Analytic Thinking source both emphasize how crucial this is. Purposefully engaging with diverse viewpoints, people with different backgrounds, different experiences, different expertise, different ways of thinking, dramatically expands your own understanding. It helps you spot your own biases by seeing how others view the same situation differently, and it prevents you from getting locked into just one way of thinking about a complex problem.
How do you do that systematically?
Well, the Applied Critical Thinking Handbook describes several techniques, things like Team A, Team B analysis, where different teams are explicitly assigned to argue for contrasting perspectives or options, or deliberately employing several different analytical frameworks or cultural lenses when trying to understand something complex, like analyzing a foreign political or social environment.
Trying on different glasses to see things differently.
Exactly. It also mentions the circular response technique as a group method designed specifically to foster respectful listening and actively incorporating elements of others' ideas into your own thinking, moving beyond just adversarial debate towards a more synthesized understanding.
Okay, what about when you're trying to explore solutions or make decisions? How do you ensure you're really considering the best options and not just settling?
Right, avoiding that default mode thinking where you just grab the first plausible idea. The handbook stresses the need to explore alternatives rigorously. It recommends a two-phase process. First divergence, then convergence.
Divergence. Spreading out.
Exactly. Divergence techniques, with brainstorming being the classic example, aim to generate the largest possible quantity of ideas related to the problem, without any censorship or judgment allowed during that phase. The goal is just sheer volume, widening the pool of potential options as dramatically as possible. Get everything out on the table, no matter how wild it seems initially.
Just get it all out there, good, bad, or crazy.
Precisely. Then, once you have that wide range of possibilities, you shift to convergence techniques. These are methods designed to systematically refine, evaluate, compare, and prioritize those ideas to arrive at the best course of action.
So narrowing down from the big list.
Right. Examples mentioned include things like dot voting, where participants get a limited number of dots or votes to place on the ideas they think are most promising, or a method called My 15%, which often involves using weighted and sometimes anonymous feedback to score and rank the generated ideas. These methods help ensure that the final decision isn't just dominated by the loudest person in the room or the highest ranking individual, but actually incorporates broader input and more careful consideration.
You mentioned an example from the handbook earlier, the Ariel Red team. Did that use one of these methods?
Yes, that's a perfect illustration of convergence revealing hidden issues. In that case, a group of leaders had seemingly reached consensus on a plan during a meeting. Everyone nodded along, but then they used a weighted anonymous feedback method similar to My 15% to assess commitment and perceived executability.
And what happened?
The anonymous feedback revealed that actually 6 out of the 9 participants secretly had significant unvoiced objections and felt the plan, as designed, was not realistically executable. The anonymity allowed these critical dissenting opinions to surface opinions that likely would have been suppressed in a standard face-to-face discussion due to group dynamics or deference to authority.
Wow. So it uncovered the real consensus, or lack thereof?
Exactly. It showed the power of structuring the interaction to overcome barriers like groupthink and hidden assumptions, allowing them to recognize the risks they hadn't openly discussed, and then redesign the plan much more effectively.
Speaking of assumptions, explicitly challenging them was mentioned as another key practice. How do you do that deliberately?
This is absolutely fundamental to critical thinking. You can't just accept the premises given to you or the ones you implicitly hold yourself as automatically true. The Applied Critical Thinking Handbook discusses this as a very deliberate practice. It mentions there's even a structured 4-step process that intelligence analysts, for instance, can use. Though the specific details weren't fully laid out in the provided source snippet, the core principle is clear.
Yes, the principle.
It's about systematically identifying both the explicit assumptions, the ones stated, and more importantly, the hidden or implicit assumptions that underpin an argument, a plan, or your own thinking, and then actively challenging them. Does this assumption have to be true for the conclusion to hold? What evidence supports this assumption? What if this assumption is wrong?
Why is challenging them so important?
Because doing this helps expose faulty logic, it can reveal hidden dependencies or links between ideas that weren't obvious. And critically, it helps you prepare for unexpected circumstances or changes that would invalidate a key assumption. The handbook emphasizes checking if assumptions are both valid, meaning likely to be true based on evidence, and also necessary, meaning the conclusion actually depends on them.
And too many assumptions is a red flag.
Potentially, yes. An excessive number of assumptions, especially if they're untested, questionable, or very sensitive to change, can signal a higher level of risk or uncertainty in the analysis or plan. So constantly questioning the foundations your ideas are resting on, it's a core critical thinking habit.
Okay, that's a lot of serious technique. Can we shift back to something maybe a bit more fun and accessible? You mentioned practicing through activities and games earlier.
Absolutely. Let's circle back to that. Both the HBS online article and that VDS source highlight that engaging with certain kinds of puzzles, games, and structured activities is actually a highly effective and definitely more enjoyable way to build and hone these cognitive muscles.
Like what kind of games?
Well, the HBS source mentions common examples like crossword puzzles, reading mystery novels where you're constantly analyzing clues and evaluating suspects, logic puzzles, riddles, Sudoku, which is pure logical deduction, and strategic board games that require planning, anticipating opponent moves, and adapting your strategy.
Things many people do for fun anyway.
Exactly. And the Vidia source provides tons of specific, more classroom-oriented activities we touched on earlier, but let's think about why they work in building these skills.
Okay, let's group them by skill.
Good idea. So, activities like following directions, where you have to, say, draw something based on a series of complex sequential steps, they teach precision, the importance of attending to detail, understanding order and sequence, all crucial for systematic analysis.
Right, you miss one step, the whole thing is wrong.
Precisely. Then you have classification activities, like wrong rhymes or odd one out. These require you to identify patterns, apply rules consistently, and then, importantly, justify your conclusion. Remember the soccer, tennis, track, bowling example. You identified bowling as the odd one out. Why?
Well, soccer, tennis use a ball between players. Track doesn't use a ball. Bowling uses a ball. But the target is pins, not really interacting with another player's ball directly. It's about the type of ball use or lack thereof.
Exactly. You had to articulate the underlying rule or characteristic that distinguishes bowling from the others in that specific context. It's not just guessing, it's explaining the logic.
Okay, what about sequencing and predicting?
Activities like those math tricks that predict your age or birthday, or prioritizing items needed for survival on a desert island, or even just planning a complex schedule. They all build skills in logical ordering, foresight, considering necessary steps, and anticipating potential outcomes or consequences.
Thinking ahead.
Yes. Evaluating activities are also key. Things like writing my book review, where you have to explain why you liked or disliked something, compare it to other books, assign a rating based on criteria. Or that twins activity.
Finding similarities between different things.
Right. Finding similarities between seemingly dissimilar things, like fish and soap. What could they possibly have in common?
Both found near water. Both can be slippery.
Good ones. Or puppies and babies.
Okay, that's easier. Both require a lot of care. They grow quickly. They make noise. They can be messy.
See? This forces you to look beyond the obvious surface differences and find deeper underlying connections, relationships, or shared characteristics. It's about seeing abstract links.
Seeing the connections others might miss. Very analytical.
Precisely. And finally, synthesizing activities. These push you to combine existing knowledge in new ways, like 1,000,001 uses, where you brainstorm unconventional uses for an everyday item like a paperclip or a shoebox, or amazing analogies, where you first have to figure out the type of relationship in the first pair, like part whole, synonym antonym, cause effect, function.
Like dry is to dessert as wet is to.
Right. You identify the relationship, characteristic dot place, and complete it maybe ocean or rainforest, or palm is to hand as soul is to.
Relationship.part.whole.
Exactly. These games push you to think flexibly, creatively, combine ideas, see different kinds of abstract relationships, and apply those patterns. They make these often abstract cognitive processes feel much more concrete and engaging.
So lots of ways to practice through activities. What about learning from actual experience and interacting with others? Reflection and collaboration came up.
Yes, the ERIC source specifically discusses reflective learning. This is where you consciously take the time to review and analyze your own experiences, successes, failures, confusing moments to try and extract deeper insights and understanding from them. What happened? Why did it happen? What could I do differently next time?
Learning from doing, but consciously.
Yes, with deliberate reflection. Collaborative learning is also highlighted the idea that interacting with others, working cooperatively on tasks or problems, can enhance understanding and retention. You get exposed to different perspectives, you have to articulate your own thinking clearly to others, you might build on each other's ideas.
Okay, and that ERIC source described a specific study using these methods, right? Did the study actually show that reflection and collaboration improved analytical and critical thinking skills?
This is a really important nuance to pull out from that source. While the general ideas of reflection and collaboration are widely supported in educational theory and align with many principles we've discussed, like seeking multiple perspectives, the specific quantitative study described in that ERIC paper, well, based only on the data presented in the table within that paper. It did not find a statistically significant difference in the measured analytical or critical thinking skills between the experimental group, who used a specific combination of reflective and collaborative learning methods, and the control group after the intervention period.
Okay, that's a key finding. So while the principles sound good, maybe they help in other ways, this particular study, with its specific methods and ways of measuring the skills, didn't actually demonstrate a measurable improvement in those analytical or critical thinking test scores based on the data shown.
Correct. It's a good reminder that while certain teaching methods feel intuitively right or align with broader principles of good practice, empirically measuring their direct impact on complex cognitive skills like critical thinking in a controlled research setting is actually very challenging. The results can really vary depending on the specifics of the intervention, how the skills are defined and measured, the duration, the participants, and so on.
So it doesn't necessarily mean reflection and collaboration are useless.
Not at all. The underlying principles, structured reflection on experience, engaging productively with others' viewpoints, are still widely advocated in other sources as being beneficial for developing thinking dispositions, like open-mindedness, for exposing you to different perspectives that challenge your own, and for helping you articulate your reasoning. Just that proving a direct, statistically significant boost in standardized skill scores from a specific short-term intervention can be difficult.
Okay, so maybe don't discount the value of reflection and collaboration entirely, but be aware that demonstrating their direct, measurable impact on skill test scores in this specific study can be complex and might not always show up significantly.
Exactly. It's a nuance worth remembering when evaluating educational research. And finally, of course, there's always the avenue of formal learning.
Taking a course.
Right. Taking courses specifically designed to teach analytical skills or critical thinking methods, as noted by sources like HBS Online and Knowledge Academy, can provide structured instruction, focused practice, and expert feedback. That can be a very effective path for many people.
And higher education.
Yes, postgraduate study, as highlighted by the Open University source, is often inherently centered around developing critical thinking. The demands of reading widely across different perspectives, deeply questioning sources and arguments, and needing to form your own independent, well-supported arguments based on evidence. That whole process is, at its heart, advanced critical thinking development.
It forces you into it.
It really does. And one interesting suggestion from the evaluative review is that perhaps introducing some basic epistemology.
The study of knowledge itself.
Yeah, thinking about how we know what we know, where knowledge comes from, the different ways of knowing, like empirical evidence versus intuition versus authority. Introducing these ideas earlier in education might actually help students better understand and overcome some of those barriers we discussed, like over-reliance on intuitive judgment. It could give them a framework for evaluating the very basis of claims and beliefs.
So it seems like enhancing these skills is really a multifaceted effort. It involves becoming aware of the barriers, deliberately practicing with a whole variety of activities and techniques, doing that hard work of introspection and self-awareness, consciously seeking out different perspectives, rigorously challenging assumptions.
And potentially engaging in formal learning, too.
Yeah.
It really is a continuous process of challenging your own mind and consciously refining how it works.
Okay, so after putting in all this effort, the awareness, the practice, the challenging, what's the real tangible payoff? We've talked about why these skills are important in theory, but what do you actually gain in the real world by developing stronger analytical and critical thinking abilities?
Well, the benefits are significant, and they really touch almost every area of life. But they are particularly visible in professional development and career paths. The sources are very clear that these skills are incredibly highly valued in today's job market.
Leading to better jobs.
Definitely. The Aluba and Knowledge Academy sources explicitly link strong analytical and critical thinking skills to specific, often well-paying careers.
Can you give us some examples mentioned in the sources?
Sure. They note roles like business analysts. These are people who use analytical thinking constantly to evaluate business operations, identify problems, find efficiencies, and propose solutions. Salaries mentioned were often around £75,000.
Okay, that's significant.
Others. Cybersecurity analysts were mentioned people who have to analyze threats, vulnerabilities, complex system logs to protect information systems. Their average salary was noted at around £87,000. And data scientists, of course, who apply both analytical and critical thinking to complex data sets to extract meaningful insights, build predictive models, and drive data-informed decisions. Their average was around £81,000. Other related analytical roles mentioned included data engineers and data governance analysts.
So these aren't just abstract skills. They're directly correlated with in-demand, well-compensated careers where the core function is analysis and critical evaluation.
Absolutely. And beyond those specific job titles, these skills fundamentally enhance your ability to solve problems and troubleshoot issues effectively in any field or role. As Primiest, Aluba, and the Evaluative Review all highlight, they simply enable you to make better, more informed decisions.
Whether that's a big business strategy decision
Or a complex personal choice, or even just figuring out which news sources are credible and which aren't in your daily life, better thinking leads to better choices.
And what about innovation? How do they connect there?
They are seen as crucial drivers of innovation and efficiency. By systematically analyzing existing processes or situations, that's the analytical thinking part, and then questioning the underlying assumptions about how things must be done. The critical thinking part, you can identify inefficiencies, spot unmet needs, or brainstorm completely new and creative solutions. They help you break out of the status quo and find better ways.
Finding opportunities others miss.
Exactly. And interestingly, you mentioned earlier how they can even help with teamwork and communication.
Yes, that seemed maybe less obvious.
But the Applied Critical Thinking Handbook makes that link explicitly. It points out that these skills can significantly improve interpersonal communication, teamwork dynamics, and even negotiation outcomes.
How so?
Well, by using critical thinking to genuinely try and understand others' perspectives, and using analytical thinking to understand their motivations or the constraints they're operating under, and then being able to clearly articulate your own reasoned position. This combination helps you acknowledge different talents and viewpoints within a team, bridge gaps in understanding more effectively, and ultimately work together more productively towards shared goals. It can increase morale and overall team effectiveness.
That's a really powerful range of benefits then, stretching all the way from individual career advancement and better decision-making to actually improving how teams collaborate and communicate.
They really are foundational competencies, essential for navigating complexity, for collaborating effectively, and just for making sound judgments in this incredibly complex world we live in.
All right, well, we have taken a truly comprehensive deep dive into analytical and critical thinking today. It seems abundantly clear from all these sources that these aren't just academic buzzwords or abstract concepts floating around. They are absolutely essential tools for navigating that constant flood of information we all face every single day.
And the really good news, the encouraging message that comes through again and again in the sources is that these are not fixed, innate abilities that you're either born with or you're not. They are very much skills and dispositions that can be actively developed, practiced, and strengthened throughout your life.
It takes work, though.
It does. It requires becoming more aware of those cognitive barriers and biases that tend to trip us all up. It requires engaging in deliberate practice using some of the activities and techniques we discussed. And it requires consciously applying methods like challenging your own assumptions, actively seeking out multiple perspectives, and using structured ways to analyze information and arguments.
But by doing that work, the payoff is becoming a more confident, more capable thinker overall. You're just better equipped to evaluate information effectively, make sounder judgments, and contribute more meaningfully to solving problems.
Whether that's in your personal life, your community, or your professional sphere, it's really about building a kind of intellectual resilience and independence.
It empowers you maybe to move beyond just passively accepting information at face value.
Exactly. And instead, form your own well-reasoned, evidence-supported conclusions, being less easily swayed by unchecked biases or those automatic, intuitive gut reactions.
Okay, so as a final provocative thought to leave everyone with, drawing from everything we've unpacked today, think about a strong opinion you currently hold. Or maybe just a recent piece of information you encountered that you accepted pretty quickly without much critical examination.
Right. Now, can you apply just a little bit of that devil's advocate approach we discussed? Ask yourself, what assumptions might I be unconsciously making about this opinion or this piece of information?
What evidence contradicts it? Is there disconfirming evidence out there that I haven't really considered or maybe dismissed too quickly?
And how might someone with a completely different background, a different set of values, or just a different mental frame view this exact same opinion or piece of information, could they see it totally differently, and why?
Challenge yourself to ask just a few of those critical questions about something you feel sure about today. Because often, it's in those moments of genuine questioning, even of our own certainties, that deeper understanding really begins.
We certainly hope this deep dive has provided you with a solid understanding of these concepts and, maybe more importantly, inspired you to actively work on honing these truly vital skills.
Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.